All right, so hi everybody, and I'm going to ask you for your names in a minute, but I'm Sarah Strauss, and as you see from the opening slide, this is a presentation that my PhD student Rachel actually just gave down at CSU on Friday to talk with a variety of different scholars in the Front Range who work mostly in political science, but a bunch of different areas. To try and develop networks, at least along the Front Range, of people working on environment and environmental governance issues. So it's quite a nice thing. So I'm just cribbing off her slideshow here that is introductory to our part of the BANR project, which is task 3.6, a socioeconomic and policy analysis, although I'll also talk very briefly about task 6, which is health and safety, another relevant piece to it. The one that hasn't gotten as much started. My background a little bit, I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I have also a degree in public health, and what I work on is basically at the intersection of environment and health in areas related to water, climate change, energy transitions, and that sort of thing, and I've done fieldwork in India, north and south, and also in Switzerland, as well as in the Rockies. And I've been at the University of Wyoming for 20 years. So that's just who I am. I'm going to shut off the camera now, but I'd like to hear who's in the virtual room and where you guys are. Oh, that means you have to unmute them.
Yes, let me do that. And if folks, I will, let's see, did that work? I'm not sure that I've unmuted everybody. I think some people are self-muted, but I'm going to go down the list of people on the control panel and ask you to introduce yourself. So if you need to, you can unmute yourself. So Bethany, you're the first.
Or not.
Technology. Okay, I'm going to keep going, and you might unmute yourself in anticipation if you see your name coming up. So Sarah Bucko.
Hi, this is Sarah. I don't know what else you want to know about me. But
what you teach, which state you're at, and maybe just what you're focusing on for the BANR project.
Okay, so I am in Colorado. I teach at Loveland High School, biology and environmental science, and I'm most interested in the biochar group.
Okay,
thanks. Chip?
Hi, I'm Chip Miller up in Cody, Wyoming. I teach at Cody High School. I'm an industrial technology teacher. My classes basically deal with STEM-based curriculum, and my real focus with the BANR project to date has been more on the engineering side of things and working with and getting kids to understand the pyrolysis process, the conversion of biomass into functional fuels. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Chip. Lori-Ann? I'm not sure if Lori-Ann. Oh, good.
Hi, this is Lori-Ann. I am up in Stevensville, Montana. This year I'm teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th sciences. But in 7th grade, we are focusing on, as part of the BANR part, ecosystems and the disturbances and how they affect those ecosystems.
Okay.
Thanks, Lori-Ann. Michelle?
Oh.
Hi, this is Michelle Bartholomew.
That worked. Whatever you did first worked great.
Hello. Okay, and I am the teacher resident of the BANR team, and I'm here to support teachers and our team to help get bioenergy information out to the 6 through 12 public.
Thanks, Michelle. Pat?
And can you hear me, Mom? I can't tell. Okay. I'm Pat Patterson. I'm in Riverton, Wyoming. I teach integrated science and environmental science. And our interest really, or my interest has been really with forest ecology and, the beetle kill and how that affects the local ecology and ecosystem, that sort of thing.
Great.
That's where I'm at.
Thanks, Pat. Emily, do you want to?
Sure. I'm a grad student at University of Wyoming in the Math and Science Teaching Department with a dual major in Environment and Natural Resources, and so I'm just helping out to support teachers this year. This is my last year in the program, so I'll be graduating at the end of this year.
Congratulations. Thanks, Emily.
All
Sarah
right.
Urban?
Okay, good.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I teach in Helena, Montana, and I have all sophomores biology and honors bio. And right now we're in the middle of some biochar experiments in our classroom, and then I'm also trying to, in the next year or so, incorporate all the other, forest ecology and a lot more with all of that as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Sylvia? I don't know about Sylvia. I'm going to go on to Yamina.
Hi, I'm Yamina. I am a graduate student at Colorado State, and I study soil ecology. And I've been working with the teachers primarily on the biochar experiments, but I also work in forest systems for my own field work. So there's some overlapping interest there as well. So
Thanks, Yamina. And I know that sometimes we have folks who are just on the phone, so is there anyone else?
Hi, this is Patty. I teach in Seeley Lake.
Thanks, Patty.
Did you hear that?
Yes. Patty's a middle school teacher.
I'm muting again.
Okay. Anyone else lurking on the phone lines? Okay. I'm going to put it back to you, Sarah, and I think everybody's muted themselves again, mostly.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, because that's very helpful for me to know who is out there in the virtual world, and particularly given that I want to talk about the human dimensions here, because no one was mentioning that part, and to me that's one of the more critical, obviously to me, one of the more critical things that we need to think about, and not the most obvious one, I should say, since the
Sarah,
first...
sorry, before you go on, I just wanted to mention that one or two other people jumped on during the introduction, so Logan Mannix is also here from Helena.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Logan, and what does Logan do? Logan, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, all right. So I'm a science teacher at Capitol High School with Sarah Urban, and I'm teaching earth science and biology right now. I've been trying to focus a little bit more on the ecological impact side of the BANR project.
Okay. Good. And did you say there was one more, Beth? Or just Logan?
I think that's it from what I can see.
Great. Anyway, so what I want to talk about, and I think this is, despite the fact that you guys are mostly teaching science and tech courses, it's of course always really helpful to be able to show where those human dimensions fall and why what we're talking about here is not just about ecosystems, but as you will see a little bit down the line here, about social ecological systems, and the fact that if we are indeed, as some have suggested, and the geologists will decide this summer, if we are indeed in the Anthropocene, what does that mean? And what it means, if they decide this, is that humans are the dominant feature on the landscape marked in the geologic realm, and that's a pretty strong statement. And so how do we think about our place within these systems, not just abstracting humans from the ecosystem and talking about ecological impacts and technological choices without having the embodied people there. So that's kind of what I want to talk about here. Whoops, now why is that not working? Huh, okay, no. Okay, that's weird. So, oh, okay, sorry, little technology glitch here. The cursor was sitting in the wrong place, so my clicking was not having the desired effect. Okay, so you may have already seen this slide from the various other people. I didn't actually have a chance to go back and look at the slideshows of other people, but I'm assuming you've seen something about the broader BANR project framework, the AfriCap structure of it, the fact that we are obviously in these 4 states, though we don't have as much representation in Idaho as we'd like. And though the original project is focused on how we might use beetle kill for a specific process that you've been talking about, the Cool Planet is a pyrolysis process that has biochar as a side, but in terms of how we have been approaching this project across the 5 years, with an eye to how other AfriCap projects have gone, some of their companies have gone under, and so we've decided that we couldn't really only look at beetle kill and biomass for liquid fuels in relation to this Cool Planet process, so that's obviously a starting point, but that we had to look at some broader issues about the use of beetle kill wood for whatever, particularly, of course, energy, but that could come in a number of different forms, and to understand how people think about these possibilities in a slightly wider frame than just as associated with the type of biofuel and biochar that Cool Planet proposes to produce, because they haven't quite gotten very far along in their process, and so it's just not clear how much we can rely on them to have the kinds of outcomes that we predicted we would have in the proposal. So that's just by way of saying that this general structure that you're seeing, oh, no, that won't work, never mind. I'm just going to use my pointer, but that really won't help you at all. I can use the cursor, I suppose. So that these things where it says CPES, right, we have to look at those, but we don't only look at those. Here. Okay, so task 3.6 within the BANR structure is the Socioeconomic and Policy Task Group. And so we have a couple of anthropologists and sort of economics policy folks, and we also link, of course, to the other groups, to everybody links with you guys, but also we are connected with the outreach folks who are connected in all of the communities around the state. As well as, of course, to the other tasks who are identifying the ecosystem issues in relation to forest health and that sort of thing. So, of course, no matter what we end up finding, and what turns out to be feasible in terms of using this beetle kill for a biofuel or something else that would be anything else would be more useful than what we're doing with it now. The range of stakeholders, of folks who are either working in the forests or living next to the forests or coming from Washington, D.C. to visit the forests, or politicians who make decisions about what we should do with the forests, all of these different people need to have some input and we need to account for what we have called social acceptance, though I think that's a very limited term, because social acceptance suggests that we tell you, oh, this is what we're going to do, and either you accept it or you don't, and that's not actually how human interaction with the resources really works. So acceptance is one part, and it certainly is a necessary but not sufficient condition for what might possibly be done with all of this excess beetle-killed wood. So part of the question then is number 2 is economic viability. Again, because not much is happening with this wood except for in Colorado, for example, there are somewhere on the order of 480,000 piles of beetle-killed wood that have been stashed by roadsides. And I think that actually only even accounts for the northern 2/3 of the state. And those hundreds of thousands of piles are being burned at a rate of about 700 or 800 a year because there's nothing else that we can really do with it, and the Forest Service doesn't really have enough staff to do more. And the unfortunate part of that is that, of course, what we're doing there is sending carbon directly into the atmosphere, which is really not what anybody thinks is a great idea to do with these piles. Yet we have to get the wood out of the forest where people are camping or hiking or skiing or working or doing other things. So we are really in a bit of a bind with this in terms of what the choices are for human action in relation to it. And then that goes in, of course, to the other parts of the project. How much wood can you take out and have the forest stay healthy? And of course, much of the data that exists is from the Northwest or the Southeast, much moister climates where wood that you leave on the forest floor actually rots, which doesn't really happen here. So, so these decisions are based on, need to be based on actually knowing what happens. And so the project is trying desperately in a 5-year period or less than 5 years to try and get as much information on all these different fronts as we can. And then what becomes also very interesting, and this is where why I bring up the piles on the side of the road. So the other thing that we're looking at in this group is the policies that exist from the local to the federal level, and these have huge implications. And so, for example, one of the reasons why we can't do very much with the wood except burn it is because much of the wood that we're talking about in Colorado is on federal lands. And it turns out that although there is a process in place for getting renewable fuels credit for RINs credit for using wood from other lands, that could be tribal, that could be state, that could be private, for taking that biomass and running it through Cool Planet or somebody else's process and turning it into a fuel, that if you track that whole process, you can get this credit, which makes your fuel production process profitable. But it turns out that because of federal policy, and this is where we have a really head-on clash in what we want to do to help the environment. Environmentalists are very concerned that being able to use federal lands for this RINs credit would create a gold rush on the forest, so to speak, and that we would just go trash the forest, as has happened in the past, and that therefore federal lands should be excluded. They didn't count on the bark beetle epidemic. And so now we are in this very untenable position, as I said, of actually having nothing viable to do with these giant piles of wood that would otherwise be useful, except throw more carbon in the atmosphere, which is hardly what would be on the environmentalist top agenda. So we have a real conflict, and people keep saying, well, but that could change at any moment. So this policy landscape is also not fixed, and somebody could actually push through a policy at the federal level that would reverse that, and apparently some people think that that might happen. And then at the same time, there are different policies even within different national forests, so whoever is in charge of them handles the forest management not exactly the same way. So we'd see very big differences in, say, Montana versus Colorado. In Idaho, we have almost all private land. And of course, in Colorado and Wyoming, we have a lot of checkerboarded land. So some of it's state, some of it's federal, and some of it's private. And so all of that is then affected by policy levels at the county and even in some cases city levels, depending on where you are. And so those that regulatory environment then has huge implications for what we could possibly do in terms of making decisions. So it's not just about social acceptance, okay, that'd be fine, but actually having a regulatory environment to facilitate the choices that people prefer. And so that's a real challenge, and just trying to map that out is another big part of this project. So here, as I promised, the social ecological systems model. And here you can see that what we're looking at is a range of different things. So again, at different scales, from the local to the regional to the national, and that's really important because, again, those can conflict. We have, of course, looking from left to right, the environment. We have the resource, so what's in the forest, what's the biophysical potential for using that resource for fuel or something else. And then there's the resource management practices, which of course affect what we can actually take out of the forest, what we should leave, and some of those impacts can be documented. Some of them are just things that people feel very strongly about, so perceptions. And then we have, as I was talking about policy, so we have the institutions and governance aspects of it that are controlling what's happening in the environment and making possible some things while restricting other actions. And then we have the people, right, that are also living in and around and working in and around the forests, or visiting and having particular ideas about what they expect from the forest. And of course, we go back to the 1907 Pinchot document that basically laid out what our national forests were supposed to do. And I encourage you to go take a look at it if you have a chance. It's a very small document, and it's a very instructive one to look at when we think about now, 100 plus years later, what we are trying to do and what the original vision was. And of course, in 1907, when Pinchot wrote this document about national forest resources as a multiple use place, national forests as multiple use locations, this was in contrast with the national parks and John Muir, and so preservation versus conservation becomes a very important and not yet disappeared debate. And it's different here than in other places. So in other places, say in Europe, you tend to have very much of the multiple use perspective all over. They don't have much in the way of wildlands, and so they don't see them as something critical to maintain, and that debate is much stronger here. So that's another document resource for you to take a look at. I'm sure it's available in full text on the web for free in a bunch of different places, and it's a very tiny little booklet, so it's a fun thing to look at. Anyway, so you have, of course, not just what people are doing, but what they're thinking. So attitudes, perceptions, practices, knowledge, what they know, right? And a whole bunch of this is, of course, not an exhaustive list of the livelihoods and society factors. But all of those pieces work together at these different scales for us to then try and determine, and with respect to what the goal of the BANR project is, the feasibility of a woody biomass energy industry in the Rocky Mountain region, and whether that's something that is going to be viable or not. And so these are all the things that we are looking at. In terms of economic viability, there's your basic cost-benefit analysis, and just seeing, much of this wood resource is in very inaccessible areas. It's in roadless areas in some cases, and certainly people don't want to put roads in roadless areas. So getting it out in those cases may not be at all possible. In other cases, there are going to be a variety of different costs, fuel and health and others involved in pulling out a whole lot of stuff. And again, this was the model from Cool Planet that is very appealing, that they have a distributed process for that is quite small and can fit on a couple of semi-trucks in theory. Again, they haven't ever done this, so we really don't know that. They have their tiny little produce-a-gallon factory, and they're trying to build a big, scaled-up, real commercial factory, and this is supposed to be somewhere in between, but this is still imaginary. So in theory, it would be really nice if we could have these modular units, and we could take them to where the resource was and have a very minimal impact on the landscape and minimal cost, therefore, economic and otherwise, and then we can do this kind of calculus. And so that's one part of our project. Then, as I mentioned, the public policy issues, right, that can facilitate or constrain the ability to do this biomass to energy industry in this region. And so you'll see in all of these things, methods, to go back down there, surveys, interviews, and deep hanging out. So in anthropology, so what is a bit unusual in this particular project is that there are two cultural anthropologists on this, me and Kathy Galvin at CSU. And Kathy works in Mongolia, she works in Kenya, she works all over the place with people who live in grassland areas primarily, not so much forest areas, but with agricultural issues and resource issues, as well as climate change, drought, kinds of things that we are quite familiar with here as well. When we first started working on this project, the question came up, well, actually, they didn't want to list us as anthropologists on the grant proposal, which we found to be quite humorous, and soil scientists were listed as soil scientists, and, you know, botanists were listed as botanists, and we got listed as social scientists, and economists were listed as economists, not as social scientists. So we thought this was hilarious, and the comment that came back was, but what will the USDA think? They'll think that Margaret Mead is working on this project, and why would Margaret Mead be on a biofuels project? Well, so this is a very interesting point, but we did convince them to list us as anthropologists, and this is relevant because, in fact, one of the larger reasons why this is an important project to do outside of our own mess with having all this dead wood lying around the Rockies is that, of course, this is a project that is intimately connected with climate change. And it's intimately connected with climate change in two ways that I find extremely interesting. The first is, of course, that the beetle kill, you know, bark beetles are, of course, endemic to this region. It's not like it's an unusual thing to have them. However, the extent of this epidemic is because we have not been having as cold winters as we used to. And so the beetles do not get killed off regularly and therefore rage out of control. And also maybe going to new zones because they are because of the climate change. So we have a climate change impacts problem on one hand, and of course the idea of using what Cool Planet claims, and we all do love the thought of this holy grail, though again not fully convinced that it's possible, but they make a claim that using their process, this dual process with the biochar production and the biofuel production, that they have a carbon negative process, that they are pulling more carbon from the atmosphere than they are putting back in when you burn the fuel. That's a pretty heady claim, and of course everybody would like to make that happen. But that, of course, is a mitigation effort then in terms of climate change and trying to reduce the amount of carbon that we have in the atmosphere. So to me, this is a bit of a soup to nuts project. It's very interesting and really gets at these bigger issues of how we address climate change in broader contexts. And this is relevant back to Margaret Mead because little known and kind of fun fact, the very first scientific conference on climate change in the United States was convened by Margaret Mead, who was then the president of the AAAS, the people that put out Science magazine. She convened a conference of what later was, you know, the who's who of climate scientists in the 80s and 90s in 1976. And she was actually at a think tank in North Carolina whose focus was actually on health, not on environmental issues. And she convinced them that they had to host this conference because the health of the whole planet meant the health of everybody on it, and that's why it was a critical issue to address in 1976. We've been at this for a long time, folks. And anthropology has been in it from the beginning. So, and so what anthropologists do, and here you see on the social acceptability screen how we look at everything from, again, the individual level out to and their relationships as individuals, members of communities, institutional structures, and out to the much broader social level. And we do what's known as deep hanging out. So ethnographic research involves being there. So not just going in and finding some people and talking to them in an interview, recording it, and disappearing again, but actually hanging out so that we understand fully what the implications are of what they're saying, that we have a much better idea of, again, using, you see here, archival research as well as things like GIS that can give us spatial relationships and other kinds of tools, as many tools as we choose to use, because in the anthropology world, anything that has to do with people is fair game. We don't stop at the economy or at the psyche and psychology, etc. We get to do anything we want as long as it has to do with humans, and in this project, humans interacting with their environments. Okay, and so This summer, we finally have some sites, and we're going to be going out and getting some preliminary understandings of how people talk about these issues that I've mentioned. And so we semi-structured interviews, trying to get a range of different folks in the communities and people working in the forest to understand what they think are big issues, rather than imposing our issues on them or what we theoretically think should be important. The question is, how do people in these communities see the problems and potentially the solutions? Okay, and so some of the questions are there, and then it's almost 3:30 and we only have another 15 minutes, so I wanted to get to a conversation with you all to think about some of the ways that the information that we'll be looking at can be done in local scales out in your communities. And so there are a number of different kinds of projects that would be extremely interesting. So you might, given that you guys are mostly teaching hard science courses, you might communicate across the curriculum with some of your English and social science colleagues about ways that they might join you in connecting information about the ecosystem or the fuel production process or the ways that biochar can be used with what people in the community might be able to tell you, for example, oral histories. So if you're in a community that lives near a forest, are there people who have family members? Are there grandparents who could come in and talk? Are there interviews that could be done with people's relatives who have some connection to forest products industry or the energy industry more broadly, which of course is also impacting all over our region, and see how we might make the connection back to the forests. Archival projects are lots of fun, and any town that has a history museum or some kind of archive, or even online, your local newspaper may go back pretty far. And it'd be interesting to see what kinds of conversations have occurred in the public domain with regard to forests and fuel and their associations as well. Have there been heated debates already that people have kind of forgotten about from 15 years ago or 35 years ago or 70 years ago? Human activities with respect to the carbon cycle. So you're teaching about the science, but then how do our decisions about land use, forest management, energy, et cetera, affect the carbon cycle? So this is, again, the bigger carbon climate change impacts and then mitigation aspects that I was mentioning. These are things that you can talk about in relation to this project as well. And GIS is another great tool, and there's a lot of information I think that will be available publicly eventually on the BANR site for the GIS that we're doing. I'm not quite sure what state it's in now, but they've been doing a lot of things in the region so that you'd be able to compare what Saratoga, Wyoming looks like in comparison with Helena, Montana in terms of the forests. And I think those GIS resources are really great because by slipping in different layers that have to do with health or economic status, socioeconomic status, or again, hopefully one of the things that we'll be adding to this is that policy data layer that will categorize different policy strategies across our region. You can then compare those with other measures of forest health or clear cut, other kinds of things. So I think I'm going to close it there, and then you have my email. I'm happy to communicate about that, and just to open it up for questions or discussion of potential projects.
Thanks, Sarah.
Anyone? Thoughts?
I would ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
I was intrigued by the idea of GIS projects and putting, layers on maps to look at different variables that might be interesting and relevant to the project. Are you planning on working with the GIS folks in BANR to put some of those kinds of socioeconomic layers onto maps that might be available?
Doing that, yes, absolutely. There's so much that can be done with that, and it's definitely on our list for sort of later on once we have a better sense of these different domains.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's something that's going to be sort of produced like in year 5, or maybe will there be kind of early versions in years 3
That's
or
a
4?
hard call. I don't think we'll know until at least after this summer when we see, when we kind of really get out into the communities and first of all see what resources are there. Nobody's done much more than just identify the locations at this point. That's about as far as we got this spring. But I think we'll have a better idea by next fall when we might be able to be more active in that.
Great. And do you have, I seem to remember that maybe you were involved in some ideas about like having some relevant bibliographies or kinds of things. Do you have some resources that you think might be, is there somewhere that some of that is archived?
Right. We are developing a Zotero database of forest-related resources, and it's still in the development phase. It hasn't really been shared with the other members of BANR, but I think there are some other groups that are also working on that, and so ultimately the idea would be to merge those. In order to do that and make it accessible to people, somebody needs to have there needs to be some ownership or some institutional capacity. But ultimately, one would hope that at the very least, there would be a printed PDF. Whether it would be the interactive database, that's a whole other question, because that again requires hosting beyond the 5-year period.
Right. Pat, did you have a question?
Okay, here we go. Currently, what we're doing in my environmental science classes, we're discussing beetle kill, and we just finished our unit on alternative energy and alternative fuels. And as we go through all of these different topics, as we study these things, we constantly come back to, like you talk about, I guess the history or the socioeconomic impacts of these things, how beetle kill affects who goes to the forest and how many people actually visit. Do you want the aesthetics of it? Do you want to visit a campground that's completely dead of trees? That sort of thing. And then again, what to do with the beetle kill and that stuff. And more or less what I guess my problem is, we just get into more or less just I guess discussion or oral discussion, and I guess what I'm trying to find out is have you got ideas on to have more of a concrete activity or assignment, a way to I guess tie those things together, but give them something to do that allows them to kind of coalesce all these ideas together. That's not just a class discussion, something that's concrete that they can actually do, and that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, well, I used to, this is way back in the dark ages of the 90s, I used to use a SimCity spin-off that let us do modeling of impacts of decisions, basically, on ecosystems, and so that you could really see this. And people have done, I kind of have a two-pronged response here. One is that there isn't an answer, of course. There are going to be different answers in different communities. So the takeaway that you can discuss this infinitely, but you have to at some point cut bait or not, but that different communities are going to come to different conclusions about what they value. That's kind of important, that there isn't a single answer or a calculus that you can make that's going to come out with a quantitatively determined and equally correct answer every time. That said, there are a lot of different, and this might be an interesting thing to work on for the ed team, to think about some kind of participatory game. It doesn't have to be an online thing. It can be really just as simple as, and I don't know if you've ever seen the wedges for climate change. So there's, we have to make choices about what our energy mix is going to look like if we want to try and well, not keep it to 350 since we're already over 400, but in any event, not make it too much worse. There's pretty clear quantitative measures of if you use this fuel, this is your outcome, unless we have radical technology changes. And so people can look at their mix and make decisions. Do I want the risk of nuclear? Do I want the risk of coal? Do I want the risk? Everything has its risks. And those discussions give a very real-world sense. And so it might be interesting to see about making a similar game in terms of, again, people's perceptions. Because, for example, many people see wind as an aesthetically problematic resource, and others view that same landscape of wind turbines as embodying the values of a low or no carbon future, and that seems to be aesthetically pleasing to them. And so those are conversations that are important to have with students, to understand that those are not fixed values, those are cultural, and cultural values are determined by people's experiences, their histories. In the case of the wind example that I give, we've seen in Wyoming that people who are really, you would consider the same population, but who have had very different experiences, people who lived on the land through the 80s and then in the bus cycle ended up losing their land or most of their land and moving to Casper, say, and having a job that was a more urban for Wyoming kind of job, then felt very strongly about why wind turbines on the landscape that they had quite a nostalgic fondness for was problematic, whereas their same cousins and neighbors and friends who were still on the land saw those same turbines as a way to keep their land intact for their kids and grandkids, and that the multiple use of having the wind turbines there with cattle or whatever was a very positive thing to them. And so virtually the same population viewing this type of energy innovation radically differently. And so there's not a right answer there. That's just the kind of value-based choices that we make in every community based on our own personal and regional, again, community histories. I know in Montana this is a big concern. There's been a lot of logging, and that's part of people's heritage, but it's kind of grinding to a halt these days because there aren't so many people working in that industry, and they're headed off to North Dakota. And I know Peter Kolb has made the point that this is a very, very big concern in Montana, not the sort of thing you see in Wyoming and Colorado, because we've basically got no forest products industry to speak of anymore. And what we have is a lot of national forests that we can't do these same things with because we don't control the resource in the same way. And so I think these are very nuanced decisions that people in communities and in states are making, and that's actually been one of the more fascinating things for me in this project, is seeing the fact that there is such huge variability across the Rockies region. I don't know if that answers your question. Gives you something else to think about.
That was a great.
Yeah, I mean that's just kind of what I was. Well, and that's what we're dealing with, because it's not just to me it's not a right or wrong answer. There's just so many nuances that I guess I want the kids to come up, provide them the information, and then they make their own decision.
Yeah.
What to you makes the most sense, and so that's kind of where I'm at.
And understand, I would say the critical step with that in working with students is to make sure that they understand that how they come up with that is a product of their particular culture, their family's experiences, right? So, and their community's experiences, and that it doesn't have more validity than somebody else's family or community experiences, which maybe likely are 180 to the ones that they came up with. So I think that in terms of listening to each other and seeing that validity across the spectrum is pretty important.
Sarah, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up to Pat's question, which is, I seem to remember in some of the BANR whole group meetings that there is an idea of developing like a decision platform for stakeholders. Do you know about that?
Yeah, and that I think goes with the life cycle people, and I'm not sure, it's not part of our job so much in terms of the basic social science, but I know that's on the table. I'm not quite sure what the status of that particular thing in terms of the decision tool. I think that's mostly Keith's domain, but
okay.
and life cycle analysis and decision stuff, I think, was kind of going together, but I'm not 100% certain of that.
So, Sarah, Logan here.
Yep.
I was just, when I think about something like this, I think it's all incredibly interesting. The hard part is trying to figure out how, some of these things could take a lot of time to actually get into and research, and a lot of us are teaching real general ed courses.
Yeah.
So trying to think about how we could apply this in maybe shorter time. You mentioned kind of the game. The thing that comes up in my mind is the BANR, not BANR, the the other biofuels project out of
NARA?
Yeah, NARA. They put out a Fueling Our Future curriculum, and they had a stakeholder position analysis for all their different biofuels, and I could see that as an interesting way for students to get in and in a fairly short time start look at this from the point of view of different groups, even if it's a group that wouldn't necessarily agree with their point of view.
Right.
And